Now for this last video, we're going to be looking into things that have more to do with human populations than anything else. And one of the things we look at when we look at human populations and how they're distributed is looking at age pyramids. Age pyramids show basically the age breakdown, the distribution of ages in a population. So do you have a much older population? Do you have a younger population? These are things that can kind of tell us about what's going on with that population. When we're looking at different countries, we can look at those that are more developed or less developed. And in a more developed country, the population continues to grow as it ages. The birth rates, the death rates, and population growth of a human population are influenced by industrialization as well. And so if we look at low industrialization, early industrialization, and high industrialization, we'll see differences in the birth, death, and population growth rates. In a low industrialization country or population, we see that the birth rate is very high, but the death rate is also very high, meaning overall our population growth is low. Because while many babies might be born, many individuals are also dying. So the births and the deaths kind of cancel each other out. When we look at the early industrialization, where we're looking at big changes in terms of economics, in terms of healthcare, in terms of access to education, we see that the birth rate still stays high, but the death rate is now lowered because now we have better access to education, we have better access to healthcare, we have better access to employment. And so that's going to allow us to have a high population growth. And then once we've reached high industrialization, now we have real major progress in economic growth. We have better access to healthcare, but we also have better access to education, including things like sex education. And so we see that the birth rate starts to drop. The death rate is also dropped. And so because both the birth and death rates are low, the population growth is now low again. Now, adaptability is one thing us humans are great at and makes us great for survival. If we look at the current human population, we're at about 7 or so billion people. That's a lot of people on this planet, and we're looking at about 80 million being added to the population every year. The approximate carrying capacity for humans is 11 billion people, but that's really not too far off because, again, we're growing exponentially. So if we look at how many people have elapsed between 500 million and a billion, it's been about 10,000 years. And then from 1 billion people to 2 billion people, it was 80 years. 2 to 4 billion was 45, and 4 to 7 billion was 36 years. So going from 7 billion to 11 billion is not going to take very long at all unless we start doing something. So here is our population growth. We had 5 million individuals back in 8000 BC. We're now at 1 billion in 1855, and we see that making that basically the gain of about a billion took so many, thousands of years, but it only took, 80 years to go from 1 billion to 2 billion. And then it only took, 45 years to go from 2 to 4. And then it only took about 30 some odd years to go from 4 to 7. So we're seeing it get faster and faster and faster. We're adding about 80 million people to the world population every single year. So it's really not going to take long to get from that 7 billion range to that 11 billion range. Now, when we look at how much land, food, water, fuel, and other resources are required per person on average, we call that the ecological footprint. Now, some of the world has shortages in these resources. They might not have access to food. They might not have great access to clean water. We're also looking at things like economics. We're looking at job availability and viability. We're looking at a lot of different factors. And so in some areas of the world, those populations of humans have already reached their carrying capacity because they just simply cannot feed everyone or house everyone or provide the needed resources for everyone. And so the question that we can ask ourselves is also, how much are we willing to sacrifice to allow more people to live on the planet stably? that's one thing that we have to think about within our own lifetime, since we're probably going to reach that carrying capacity within this lifetime. So how do we maximize a number? Should we maximize a number, or should we reduce the number and increase the resources for each person, do something else? These are questions, these are more ethical or moral questions that we have to ask ourselves and ask of those who are in power or in charge. How can we basically control the human population ethically so that we're not destroying the planet and in turn not destroying ourselves? Remember, again, we're not looking at higher sophisticated or lower and primitive organisms, and that includes looking at populations of humans. We also don't want to just think of ourselves. We're looking at all extant species, bees, bears, butterflies. All of these different organisms are important, and they all have their own place on this planet. So we don't want to just consider the impact on ourselves and the human population. We also want to look at the impact we have on other species. There's a lot of complexity to this situation as well, and when we ignore other species, we're ignoring that and treating ourselves as if we're in a vacuum. Remember, we're not in a vacuum, and we rely on other organisms for a lot of things. For a lot of things like medicines, for agriculture, and honestly just for being and feeling good about ourselves and feeling good in life. So we have to make sure we're taking the whole picture in when we're trying to decide what's the maximum number of humans that can exist on this planet, and how do we disperse those resources amongst people and other organisms.